a contract in this court. These are your laws, not my laws. These are your rules, not my rules.
You are facing 3 counts of murder. Each carries the possibility of the death penalty.
I understand what you're saying.
Excuse me a second. Let the record reflect that the defendant is laughing during the victim impact statement.
Some criminals break down in tears and plead, but these killers felt nothing. In fact, they laughed. From Alvin Foy's bizarre reaction to Scott Nelson's chilling outburst, these murderers showed no shame, even when facing sentencing behind bars. With cold smirks and even laughter, they mocked the justice system, taunted their victims' families, and treated their horrific acts like some twisted game. Let's begin.
Alvin Foy on May 3rd, 2021, you are a co-defendant, so we would expect it better from you. And
on a quiet Monday afternoon in Albany, 18-year-old China Forney was walking down Essex Street just weeks away from graduating high school. She had her whole life ahead of her, a beloved young woman, a track star, a dancer, and an inspiration to many. But in an instant, everything changed. Around 3 p.m., chaos broke out when 2 men, Alvin Foy III and Jameer Manning, opened fire on the street. But instead of hitting their intended target, a stray bullet tragically struck China in the back. She collapsed on the pavement, her bright future and dreams stolen in an instant. The police rushed to the scene, but it was too late. The young woman who had once lit up every room she entered was gone. Authorities quickly identified 2 suspects, Alvin Foy III and Jameer Manning. Manning later pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Foy, however, insisted he was innocent. Despite his claims, a jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple weapons charges. During the trial, prosecutors explained how Foy and Manning returned to the scene after a disagreement, armed and looking to prove their so-called toughness. But instead of resolving their dispute, their reckless actions took the life of an innocent young girl who had nothing to do with their conflict. At his sentencing, Foy showed no remorse. As China's sister, Nazare Forney, poured her heart out in a victim impact statement, Foy laughed. His reaction shocked the courtroom. Even the judge, Roger D. McDonough, was appalled. Any human being with a shred of decency wouldn't laugh in these circumstances, the judge said. China's family couldn't believe the betrayal. They had once trusted Foy. He had even shared meals with them. Nazare told the court, "We expected better from you. We just want you to think about the pain you caused our family." However, Foy refused to take responsibility. He interrupted the judge multiple times, insisting he was wrongly convicted. Eventually, the judge lost patience, warning that if Foy continued, he would be removed from the courtroom. In the end, the judge sentenced Foy to the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. The courtroom fell silent as justice was served, while Foy laughed at the victim's family. On the other hand, Jameer showed no emotion in his sentence. He was condemned to 20 years in prison.
You should think, all the days that you're in there, you should think about the things that you did.
Outside, Foy's father insisted that the real killer was still free. But for China's family, nothing could bring her back. China Forney was more than a victim. She was a bright young woman with dreams and talent. Her family carries the weight of her absence daily, with her aunt saying, "I hope he carried the same pain every single day," hoping her story warns others so no family faces the same heartbreak. Our next case is a twisted game, one where the criminal doesn't just commit murder, but thrives on it.
Constantly, you wake up every morning, there's someone who has been murdered.
The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of muffled sobs. Families sat frozen, staring at the teenager responsible for so much pain. But while they wept, he smiled. As a grieving woman cursed his name, he laughed. 17-year-old McKeem Thomas wasn't just facing justice, he was mocking it. He had just pleaded guilty to 4 separate killings, a string of violent crimes that started when he was only 14. Now he was finally being sentenced, but to him, it was just another day. Between 2020 and 2021, Thomas tore through Hamilton County, leaving behind a trail of bodies. His crimes weren't impulsive. He planned them. He set up ambushes, fired mercilessly, and even kept a photo of one of his victims' funerals as a trophy. The first killing happened in October 2020 during a robbery, but Thomas wasn't the only one armed that night. His accomplice, 19-year-old Devin Lipscomb, pointed a gun at their target, only to be shot and killed in return. Instead of stopping, Thomas continued his deadly spree. He set up another attack, using Facebook to lure 19-year-old Terrence North into a shooting. North died instantly, while another man was shot in the face but survived.
A child was also inside the car unhurt at the time. Police arrested Lorenzo Cobb in Penn's death a week ago.
Police investigators revealed that by 2021, Thomas was no longer acting alone. He was following orders. Along with 2 others, he was hired to target a man over unpaid debts. The group carried out the attack, firing multiple shots into an SUV and sadly taking the life of 27-year-old DeAndre Otis. But the violence didn't stop there. Just 2 days later, driven by revenge for a previous attack, Thomas and his crew opened fire again. This time, they gunned down an innocent bystander, 30-year-old Donnell Steele, who had only stepped outside to see what was happening. In court, prosecutors detailed Thomas's crimes, his lack of shame, his obsession with violence. The judge prepared to hand down his sentence. That's when Terrence North's cousin, her voice shaking with anger, called him out. Why did he do it? Was it money? Power? Some twisted desire to prove himself? Maybe it was all of the above. Prosecutors believed he kept North's funeral service photo to audition for more jobs. He wanted a reputation, a legacy built on fear. In the end, the court handed down its sentence, 31 to 36.5 years in prison. However, he showed no repentance for his act and chose to remain smiling. A number that felt far too small to the families who lost their loved ones. Prosecutors knew the risks of a trial. His young age could have worked in his favor. So they took the plea deal. It guaranteed he would serve time. It spared the families from the horror of a possible non-guilty verdict. As the judge announced the sentence, there was no celebration, only quiet heartbreak. For the victims' families, no punishment could bring back their loved ones. Angela Smith, Terrence North's grandmother, wiped away tears and said, "There has to be something done. These children are out there, shooting one another." Our next case is a shocking tale of deception, where greed drove someone to commit the ultimate crime.
I don't have a contract with this court. These are your laws, not my laws. These are your rules, not my rules.
On a quiet night in 2012, tragedy struck 2 homes in Phoenix, Arizona. 3 innocent people, Bruce Gaudette, Glenna Shapiro, and Lawrence Shapiro, were tied up and harmed before their homes were set on fire. The person responsible showed no hesitation, leaving heartbreak and loss behind. For years, the case dragged on, twisting through the legal system as the families of the victims waited for justice. But the most unsettling part, the man responsible, Michael Crane, showed no regret, even in the courtroom as grieving families spoke. On the nights of the murders, Crane broke into his victims' homes with a deadly plan. He tied them up, executed them in cold blood, and then set their houses on fire to destroy any evidence. Bruce Gaudette was murdered in his Phoenix townhouse, and Glenna and Lawrence Shapiro met the same fate in their Paradise Valley home. Investigators were horrified by the brutality of the crimes. Crane had no apparent connection to his victims, just a desire to steal and kill. After years of investigations, court hearings, and testimonies, the trial reached its decision. The courtroom was filled with grief. Photos of Bruce Gaudette were placed in the jury box. His daughter, Melissa, recalled how she was away at art school when she realized something was wrong. Her father wasn't answering his phone. When Crane was arrested, he was found wearing a jacket she had given her father as a gift. The sight of it was a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. During his trial for multiple murders and burglaries, Michael Crane displayed behaviors linked to the sovereign citizen movement, rejecting government authority. He insisted on spelling his name a specific way, declined court-appointed lawyers, and invoked the Uniform Commercial Code, or UCC, claiming it exempted him from legal proceedings. The judge dismissed his claims, asserting that criminal law, not commercial law, applied. Despite his arguments, the court proceeded with its conviction and sentencing. Glenna and Lawrence Shapiro's family also spoke about their devastating loss. The couple had dedicated their lives to their community, especially their work with the National Kidney Foundation of Arizona. Their deaths left a void that could never be filled. But the most disturbing part is that he showed no remorse, even when he lashed out at one of his burglary victims. Why did Michael Crane commit these brutal murders?
Petrosky, I'm sorry for your losses, but you have no business in these court proceedings at all.
Prosecutors argued that it was all about greed. He wanted money, valuables, and power. Some who knew Crane pointed to his troubled childhood as a possible explanation. His mother's boyfriend had locked him in a closet for long periods, and he once had to save his unconscious mother from drowning in the bathtub. But the prosecution made one thing clear. His crimes weren't about a tragic past. They were about a man who made calculated choices and felt nothing for the people he destroyed. Originally, prosecutors had sought the death penalty, but in the end, the families agreed to a plea deal to avoid dragging the case out any longer. The death penalty was taken off the table, and Crane was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, he feels neither shame nor guilt for his actions. Instead, he walks away with a smile. The justice system had finally put Michael Crane away, ensuring he would never be free again, but the damage he caused could never be erased. Melissa Gaudette and the Shapiro family expressed similar heartbreak. Even with the sentencing, they knew nothing could bring their parents back. Retired Phoenix police detective Kenny Porter, who had worked on countless cases, called Crane one of the most evil men he had ever encountered. He believed Crane deserved the death penalty. Our next case is a painful reminder of cruelty when the killer looked at the victim's sister and smiled.
And he was taken from us on my brother's birthday, which hurts very, very much.
It was just another night in East Price Hill until everything changed in an instant. On an ordinary evening in April 2012 in East Price Hill, Ohio, 47-year-old Grover Cleveland Watson Jr. welcomed a familiar face into his home. Tyrell Webster, a 28-year-old man he knew, had come over to do laundry, have a few drinks, and play cards. It seemed like a typical night, but what started as a casual gathering soon turned into a brutal crime scene. Among those present were Webster's pregnant girlfriend, Tasha Alexander, and their friend Paul Walls. What began as a night of socializing quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation. As the night went on, an argument broke out between Webster and Watson. Tensions escalated quickly. Webster punched Watson, and Watson defended himself by hitting Webster with a chair. Webster and Alexander left, but returned about 20 minutes later, this time with Webster armed. Alexander tried to calm things down at the back door, but Webster soon approached with a gun. The confrontation flared up again, ending with Webster fatally shooting Watson. The dispute reportedly began after Watson stepped in to defend Webster's pregnant girlfriend from his violent behavior. As soon as the shots were fired, panic set in, but Webster didn't get far. Law enforcement acted swiftly, and on the same day of the murder, he was arrested by the Southwest Ohio Fugitive Apprehension Strike Team. Justice seemed to be moving quickly, but the legal battle was just beginning. Webster's journey through the court system was anything but smooth. Before his first trial could even begin, his lawyers quit. When the trial finally started, it ended in a mistrial because the prosecution failed to provide key evidence to the defense. Despite this, when Webster later requested another mistrial, the court denied it.
Tyrell Webster was convicted of murder for killing Grover Watson over Easter weekend, April of 2012.
Throughout the case, Webster did everything he could to avoid responsibility. He even tried to shift the blame onto his girlfriend, suggesting that she was the one who shot and killed Watson. But the evidence was clear. He was the one who pulled the trigger. After years of delays, the verdict finally came. A jury found Tyrell Webster guilty on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of having a weapon under disability. As the courtroom awaited his sentence, emotions ran high. One of the most heartbreaking moments came from the victim's blind sister. Watching Webster laugh in court, she couldn't hold back her anger. Her brother had been taken from her, and the man responsible showed no remorse. When the judge delivered the final sentence, there was no escape for Webster. He was found guilty and would now face the consequences of his actions. While Tyrell Webster will spend the rest of his life behind bars, nothing can bring back Grover Cleveland Watson Jr. His family will always feel the loss, and the pain of his absence will never fully fade. Our next case is a deadly facade, where the killer's regret was nothing more than a lie.
This is a very long time. When you have duct tape around your head and you've been stabbed 7 times.
On September 27, 2017, 56-year-old Jennifer Lynn Fulford, a caregiver and house manager from Winter Park, Florida, went missing. She was well loved by the family she worked for and had no enemies. However, when she failed to show up for work, concern quickly grew. Days later, her body was found dumped off Apopka Vinland Road. When the investigation began, authorities identified a suspect, Scott Nelson. He entered the home while Jennifer Fulford was alone and restrained her. Nelson then forced her to share her ATM PIN and took her to a bank to withdraw cash. Afterward, he left her in a wooded area off Apopka Vinland Road. Detectives identified Nelson as a suspect through ATM surveillance footage, phone records, and evidence from the crime scene. A breakthrough came when authorities discovered Jennifer's stolen car abandoned at a hotel. Nelson had checked into a nearby room, and when police located him, he had some of Jennifer's belongings. Nelson, a 55-year-old man, had a history of legal troubles. His past included multiple offenses, and after being released from federal prison in 2017, he faced difficulties adjusting to everyday life. Though he initially found work and a place to stay, he later lost both and became frustrated with his situation. He blamed his probation officer for ruining his life, claiming he was left to starve on the streets of Winter Park. Fueled by anger and desperation, Nelson forced his way into a home, kidnapped Jennifer, and later took her life.
Robbery was planned, yes, but the murder was after the robbery had gone completely wrong.
Nelson admitted to causing Jennifer's death, but claimed it was never his intention. He said he had planned to rob the house to get by, but ended up holding Jennifer against her will. Instead of letting her go, he sadly took her life and left her behind. 10 days later, Nelson traveled to Jacksonville by train, where he was eventually arrested. Shockingly, he told authorities that he had allowed himself to get caught. He insisted that he had no personal reason to harm Jennifer and that she had done nothing to deserve such a fate. During his trial, Nelson was the only witness for his defense. He admitted to killing Jennifer, but refused to take full responsibility and smiled. However, Nelson was sentenced to life imprisonment. His statement shocked the courtroom as he portrayed himself as a victim rather than a murderer. The prosecution, however, made it clear that Jennifer's death was a cruel and senseless act. Jennifer Fulford's murder was an unnecessary tragedy. Her family was devastated by her tragic loss. They described her as a loving wife, mother, and friend who brought warmth and kindness to everyone she met. Her husband, Robert Fulford, spoke about the deep pain of losing her, emphasizing how much she was loved and how senseless the crime was. Up next, Melissa Lucio, a mother whose controversial conviction for the death of her young daughter has sparked heated debates over justice, false confessions, and the flaws within the legal system.
After years of appeals, a mother convicted of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, who has maintained her innocence, has been granted a stay just 2 days before she was set to be executed.
April 2007, Harlingen, Texas. The panicked voice of Melissa Lucio crackled through the 911 call. Her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah, wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found the toddler lifeless, bruises darkening her fragile body. Melissa told them it was a terrible accident. Mariah had fallen down the stairs days before. But as investigators scanned the room and studied Mariah's battered body, they weren't convinced. Hours later, Melissa sat in a sterile interrogation room. The clock ticked past 7 hours as detectives hurled question after question, accusing her of murder. Exhausted, broken, and without a lawyer, Melissa muttered, "I guess I did it." To the detectives, that was all they needed. But to many, it was the start of a wrongful conviction that would send a mother to death row. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Melissa as a violent, unstable mother who had taken her anger out on her youngest child. They zeroed in on her 7-hour confession, playing it for the jury. Melissa's face was blank, her voice flat, but her words sealed her fate.
And the interrogation continued for maybe 7 hours until 3 o'clock in the morning.
They presented Mariah's injuries, bruises, bite marks, and internal bleeding as clear signs of harm. The jury saw a mother who didn't cry on the 911 call, who sat motionless in court. But what the jury never heard was that Melissa had survived a lifetime of domestic violence, from her own mother, from partners, and even from the father of her children. They didn't know that Melissa had been pregnant with twins when Mariah died, emotionally fragile and overwhelmed. And they didn't hear from experts who could have explained how coerced confessions, especially from vulnerable women, happen all the time. In the end, it didn't matter. After just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a sentence: death. Melissa Lucio became the first Latina woman on Texas death row. For 15 years, she sat in isolation, fighting for her life as appeals were denied one after another. But as her execution date approached in April 2022, the world finally took notice.
1 week from today, Texas plans to execute Melissa Lucio for the death of her daughter, despite widespread concern she's innocent.
The Innocence Project, celebrities like Kim Kardashian, and even bipartisan lawmakers rallied behind her, pointing to the weak evidence and the glaring flaws in her trial. Pressure mounted. Then, in a stunning turn just 48 hours before she was scheduled to die, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals halted the execution. The reason? critical evidence that had been withheld from her original trial, evidence that could have changed everything. But when the stay of execution was granted years later, Melissa, speaking from death row, described it as being pulled from the edge of a cliff, but only just. She was still on death row, still waiting. Melissa Lucio's case has become a lightning rod for debates over the death penalty, the treatment of domestic survivors, and the dangers of coerced confessions. Some see her as a mother who failed her child in the worst way. Others see her as a victim of a broken system that ignores context, trauma, and truth. But one thing is certain, her death sentence didn't just shatter her life. It sent shockwaves through Texas and forced the world to question what justice really looks like. For now, she remains trapped between life and death, her fate still hanging in limbo. A mother's quiet tears left the courtroom divided. But in our next case, there was no composure. When this convicted killer heard his death sentence, his reaction left the entire courtroom reeling.
We're talking about here. You want to play like games? I'm not playing no game with you, man.
Kirkland killed 13-year-old Esme Kenny, 14-year-old Cassandra Crawford, as well as 45-year-old Mary Jo Newton and 25-year-old Kimya Rollison.
It was a warm spring evening in Cincinnati, 2006, when 14-year-old Cassandra Crawford headed out for a walk, never knowing it would be her last. She vanished into the fading daylight. No witnesses, no warning. Days later, when her body was discovered hidden in a wooded lot, the community was gripped with horror. But this wasn't an isolated tragedy. This was the work of a man who had been hiding in plain sight, a predator who had already killed before and wasn't finished yet. For years, he stalked the streets, blending into the background, while police struggled to connect the growing string of deaths. It wasn't until his final mistake that the full scale of Anthony Kirkland's twisted crimes were exposed. And when the judge handed down the ultimate punishment, his reaction left the entire courtroom stunned.
Confronted 13-year-old Esme Kenny as she was out for a jog, and you'll see that the defendant strangled her, burned her body, and left the scene.
Anthony Kirkland's trail of destruction didn't begin with Cassandra Crawford. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 1987, he killed his girlfriend in a violent outburst, setting her body on fire in an attempt to destroy the evidence. He was sentenced to prison, but the justice system gave him a second chance he never should have had. In 2004, after serving just 16 years, Kirkland was granted parole, and within months of his release, the killings began again. Between 2006 and 2009, 4 more victims fell into his path. The community was unaware that a serial killer was quietly building his body count, each crime escalating in brutality. But Kirkland had a signature, one the police wouldn't fully piece together until it was too late. His method was calculated. He targeted vulnerable women and young girls, strangled them, and then set their bodies on fire to erase any trace of what he'd done. The city remained unaware of the predator in their midst until 13-year-old Esme Kenny went for a jog one spring afternoon in 2009 and never came home. Her disappearance triggered a frantic search. Hours into the hunt, police noticed a man loitering near the crime scene, sweating, disheveled, and oddly calm. It was Anthony Kirkland. Officers questioned him, uneasy with his strange behavior, and when his alibi crumbled, they brought him in. It didn't take long before the truth came pouring out. In the interrogation room, Kirkland's cold composure was chilling. He sat there, his voice flat, detailing his crimes without a flicker of remorse. When detectives brought up Esme Kenny, the mask finally slipped. The timeline of his brutal attack fit perfectly with the evidence they had gathered. Her body had been found not far from where Kirkland was stalked, hidden in a wooded area. But Esme wasn't his only confession. In that sterile room, Kirkland unraveled the twisted web he'd built, admitting to the murders of Cassandra Crawford, Kimya Rollison, and Mary Jo Newton.
Anthony Kirkland has now admitted to killing 4 women, choking 3 of them, and stabbing the 4th. Testimony came during his 8-hour interview with police.
The trial that followed was a deep dive into Kirkland's darkness. The prosecution painted a clear picture of a man who preyed on the vulnerable, a predator who stalked his victims before striking with brutal force. The courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat shoulder to shoulder, listening in horror as each detail was laid bare. And then came the moment they'd all been waiting for. The judge prepared to read the sentence. The room held its breath. As the words death penalty echoed through the courtroom, Kirkland didn't flinch. He sat there, silently. Not a twitch of fear, not a hint of regret. Just cold satisfaction, as if he'd beaten the system in his own twisted way. Anthony Kirkland was sentenced to death for the murders of Cassandra Crawford and Esme Kenny, and life in prison without parole for the killings of Kimmy Rollison and Mary Jo Newton.
I want you to die slowly, but it's not going to happen. They go put that needle in you, and you go quick. But you tortured them children. You tortured everybody.
But Kirkland wasn't done trying to play the system. In 2016, his legal team filed for a resentencing hearing, arguing that his previous defense hadn't properly represented him. It forced the victims' families back into court, reopening wounds they had tried to heal. For days, they sat through the same gruesome details. Kirkland barely reacted, watching the proceedings with that same empty stare. In the end, the court upheld the death sentence, but not before forcing everyone back into the nightmare. In the courtroom, emotions boiled over. Families of the victims openly wept, while others seethed with rage at Kirkland's sheer lack of remorse.
Her father is devastated. He cannot and will not look you in your face. And you should be really grateful for that.
When Esme Kenny's mother stood to speak, the room fell into heavy silence. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter's innocence, her love for books, her quiet nature, and how Kirkland had ripped it all away. Her words cracked through the coldness of the room, but Kirkland sat there, unmoved, his face betraying nothing. The judge didn't hold back either, as he reaffirmed the death penalty. He called Kirkland's crimes calculated evil, but still there was no sign of regret. Kirkland left the room with that same faint smile. It was a reaction that haunted the families long after the trial ended, a look that seemed to say he was still in control. A killer who smiled at death. But in our next case, the horror wasn't uncovered in the courtroom. It was found in the most unthinkable place, when police opened the trunk of a car and found the unimaginable.
Police believe he hid the bodies for weeks after killing them in their Marion County home.
Now he's charged with killing his wife, and other charges may come depending on the autopsy results.
It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop, nothing out of the ordinary. But when officers pulled over a minivan in Georgia in September 2019, what they found inside changed everything.
All we need to know is that's evil, and evil did something. And evil needs to pay for what he did. Plain and simple as that.
The stench hit them first, a thick, sickly odor that seeped from the back of the vehicle. And then when they popped the trunk, the truth spilled out. A body, wrapped, decomposing. The man behind the wheel, calm, almost too calm. And before officers could even ask, he muttered something that would leave them frozen in place. You might want to check the house. What they found next would haunt even the most seasoned investigators. Michael Wayne Jones Jr. wasn't a stranger to the law. Behind the mask of a family man was a history of violence, control, and a string of warning signs that had been overlooked. Neighbors in Summerfield, Florida described the Jones household as tense. Something always felt off, but nothing could have prepared them for what was happening behind closed doors. Michael was married to Casey Jones, a devoted mother of 4. Friends noticed the shift in her over time. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, trapped in a life that seemed to be spiraling, but no one imagined the danger she was in. In late August 2019, family members began losing touch with Casey. Calls went unanswered, messages read but ignored. Her mother grew increasingly worried. Casey never went this long without checking in. Then, in early September, panic fully set in. Casey's mother filed a missing person report, and by then, it was already too late. The minivan that reeked of death had been carrying a grim secret. The body of Casey Jones, decomposing for weeks, as Michael drove state to state, trying to figure out his next move. But the horror didn't end there. When police followed up on Michael's chilling suggestion to check the house, they entered the family home in Florida, only to uncover a scene straight from a nightmare. Inside, they found the remains of 4 children, Casey's kids, hidden and lifeless. Cameron, 10, Preston, 5, Mercalli, 2, and Ayanna, 1, all gone. The reality hit investigators hard. Michael Wayne Jones hadn't just taken the life of his wife. He had murdered his entire family and had been living with their bodies for weeks. During his confession, Michael casually explained how the violence began. An argument with Casey spiraled out of control, and he struck her with a baseball bat. She didn't survive. After that, he turned on the children, one by one, and in their lives before attempting to cover it all up. But his escape plan was sloppy. For weeks, he drove around with Casey's body in his van, the smell growing worse until it became impossible to hide. It was only a matter of time before he slipped up, and that minor car accident in Georgia sealed his fate.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, as the sheriff of this county, underneath the jail ain't good enough. He has no right to walk the face of this earth.
In the courtroom, the sheer scale of Michael's crimes was hard to process. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They painted him as a cold, calculating killer who not only took the lives of 5 innocent people, but also tried to erase their existence. The jury took just days to come to a decision. In January 2023, Michael Wayne Jones Jr. was sentenced to death for the murder of his wife and life sentences for the murders of all 4 children. The courtroom was thick with tension as the judge read the sentence.
Clue what had gone through his mind to say, I don't know what went through his head to say I need to do this.
Family members of Casey Jones sat in the gallery, some openly sobbing, others frozen in shock. The weight of what had been taken from them was almost too heavy to bear. Michael, on the other hand, sat still, his face blank. No tears, no apologies, just a cold, hollow stare, like he was detached from the reality of what he'd done. Michael's complete lack of remorse was haunting. For many in that room, justice had been served, but it didn't bring peace. 5 lives were gone, and no sentence could fill that void. A father who destroyed his entire family. But in our next case is even more disturbing. It's not about revenge or jealousy. It's about unimaginable cruelty towards an innocent child.
She can change her story as many times as she wants, but the reality is she participated, she directed it. Who knows? I mean, she did what she did and she knew better.
On May 24th, 2013, emergency responders rushed to a hospital in Palmdale, California, carrying the fragile body of an 8-year-old boy. His injuries were so severe that doctors struggled to comprehend the horror he had endured. His name was Gabriel Fernandez. Behind closed doors, his mother, Pearl Fernandez, and her boyfriend, Isauro Aguirre, had turned his home into a house of torment. 2 days earlier, they had mistreated him so brutally that he lost consciousness. Gabriel's struggles were not hidden. For 8 months, teachers and others raised concerns about his well-being to social workers and law enforcement. Scrapes, bruises, and other injuries were clear signs that something wasn't right. However, despite these warnings, officials failed to intervene. Gabriel remained in the home, and the challenges he faced continued. Before living with his mother in Aguirre, Gabriel was cared for by his great-uncle and later by his grandparents. His life took a difficult turn when Pearl regained custody in 2012. From that point on, he endured a lot of hardships, facing constant mistreatment and being forced to do things no child should ever experience. At night, he was forced to stay inside a small cabinet. His mother and her boyfriend treated him unkindly, often making fun of him and causing him harm. Aguirre, in particular, seemed to single out Gabriel due to his personal beliefs about the boy. On May 22, 2013, the cruelty reached its peak when Gabriel was punished simply for not putting away his toys. This time, the injuries were too severe. He became unresponsive, and Pearl finally called 911.
My son is not breathing.
Your son is what?
He's not breathing.
He just was unconscious.
Okay, do you have the paramedics on the way right now? Are you right there with him?
Yes, I'm right here.
Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe to heal. He was declared brain dead and sadly passed away 2 days later. His autopsy revealed signs of serious harm and neglect, showing the hardships he had endured for a long time. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were arrested the day after Gabriel was taken to the hospital. Initially, Pearl faced felony child endangerment, while Aguirre was charged with attempted murder. However, when Gabriel died, the charges escalated to first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture. At trial, prosecutors described Aguirre as pure evil. The jury agreed, and the judge said, "The conduct was animalistic, but that could be wrong because even animals know how to take care of their young." He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Pearl, on the other hand, took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but showed no shame for her heinous act.
The mother of 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez, who was beaten and tortured to death in 2013, will stay in prison.
Gabriel's story is a painful reminder of what happens when a child's cries for help go unheard. His tragic death shook the nation, sparking outrage and calls for reform in child protective services. His short life was filled with suffering, but his memory continues to inspire change. No child should ever endure what Gabriel went through. His story must never be forgotten. In honor of Gabriel, people celebrate his 18th birthday in remembrance. A killer who sat cold and still as the death sentence was read. But in our next case, the killer couldn't hide his true emotions. When the judge revealed his fate, he let out a chilling smile that left the entire courtroom stunned.
Chad, where are Lori's kids?
Listen, just tell people what's happening. There's people around the country praying for your children, praying for you guys. Why don't you give us answers?
That's great.
That's great.
It started with two missing kids. Tylee Ryan, 16, and her little brother, JJ Vallow, just 7 years old, seemed to vanish without a trace in late 2019. Their mother, Lori Vallow, barely flinched. Her new husband, Chad Daybell, was even colder. Calm, detached, and eerily quiet as the search intensified. But when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a twisted world of doomsday prophecies, cult-like beliefs, and a dark obsession with the end of the world. And Chad Daybell? He wasn't just some passive figure in the background. He was the mastermind. Chad Daybell wasn't your typical criminal. On the surface, he was a small-town author in Idaho, writing books about the apocalypse and near-death experiences. But beneath that calm, quiet persona was something much darker.
While attending a prepper convention, Daybell was approached by a blonde-haired, blue-eyed fan named Lori Vallow. The two hit it off and started having an affair.
In 2018, Chad met Lori Vallow, a woman who shared his end-of-the-world beliefs. Their connection was instant, but as their relationship deepened, so too did their obsession with cleansing the world of what they called dark spirits. And soon, the people closest to them started turning up dead. In July 2019, Lori's husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by her brother, who claimed it was self-defense. Months later, in October 2019, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in her sleep. At first, it was ruled natural causes, but investigators would later find out otherwise. With their spouses gone, Chad and Lori married just 2 weeks after Tammy's death. But there was a bigger problem: Tylee and JJ. By late September 2019, both children had vanished. Lori kept making excuses. JJ was safe. Tylee was off at college. But when police demanded proof the kids were alive, Lori and Chad fled to Hawaii. The truth: the kids had been gone for months. On June 9, 2020, everything came crashing down. Armed with a search warrant, investigators dug through Chad Daybell's backyard in Rexburg, Idaho. Hours passed with nothing. Then, they struck something. Beneath a thin layer of soil, police unearthed JJ Vallow's body, wrapped in black plastic and bound with duct tape. Nearby, they found the burned and dismembered remains of Tylee Ryan, hidden in a shallow grave. Chad Daybell, who had been watching from his front porch, was immediately arrested. The evidence was staggering. Text messages, phone records, and even Chad's own writings showed how deeply he believed in his twisted mission. In his mind, JJ and Tylee weren't kids. They were zombies whose spirits needed to be freed. The public was horrified. 2 innocent children had been killed, buried in their stepfather's backyard, all in the name of a doomsday prophecy. Chad Daybell's trial was a media circus. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulative cult leader who twisted religious beliefs into a weapon. They described how he dehumanized JJ and Tylee, labeling them as dark spirits to justify the unthinkable.
Daybell, this religious author who wrote about end of days and dark spirits. In fact, prosecutors have presented evidence that show Lori and Chad seem to use religion as a motivation to kill.
Lori Vallow had already been convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Now it was Chad's turn to face the consequences. In May 2024, after weeks of graphic testimony and damning evidence, the jury found Chad Daybell guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder for Tylee, JJ, and his wife Tammy, as well as multiple counts of conspiracy. The final decision? Death penalty. But it was what happened next that sent chills through the courtroom. When the judge read the sentence, the courtroom was heavy with emotion. Family members of the victims sat in tears, some unable to even look at Chad. But Chad Daybell, he didn't flinch. He didn't cry. Instead, as the judge uttered the words "sentenced to death," Chad sat still with a cold, blank expression, as if he saw it all as part of some grand plan. Even the judge paused, seemingly caught off guard by Chad's eerie calm. For the families, the verdict was justice, but it would never bring back JJ or Tylee. And as Chad Daybell was led out of the courtroom, still wearing that haunting smile, it was clear he didn't regret a thing. These killers showed no remorse, even as they faced justice. They laughed, mocked, or remained completely indifferent. Their actions shattered families, leaving behind heartbreak and loss that no prison sentence could ever truly mend. In our next video on screen, we'll dive deeper into more terrifying stories and sentences that will haunt you.